much for joining us. It's early morning Eastern time, so we really appreciate your time and you being here online and talking to our audience. Thank you so much again, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful, thank you. And could somebody project the presentation that I sent over? Mariam has that, I believe. There we go. Well, thanks very much for the invitation to speak with you all today. I'm very sorry I couldn't be there in person. I was actually in Georgia last week, but couldn't stay an additional week. But glad that you're having a virtual or hybrid component to this conference, which is timely every year. But I think especially given the tumult and changes in the region, really in the past year and a half, an especially useful opportunity for you all to convene in person and virtually today and tomorrow. I know that I am, the last in what has been a pretty active day of panels and discussions. So brief so that we have a little time for discussion thereafter. I unfortunately have a hard stop at 1900, but we should have enough time to at least get into the substance in that amount of time. So if you could advance to the next slide, please. So I decided to kind of frame my remarks today to some extent inspired by my recent book that I'll talk a little bit about more in a minute, but also given that you do have this very contemporary theme running through the other panels at the conference. And I know that for the most part, I'm speaking to a room of social scientists. I am a historian. I do see a couple of other historians, on the Zoom. So good to be, in fellow company there. But I think, for all the reasons that we know, we are living in kind of times of historic change and rupture, I think, not just for this region, but globally, of course. And so, what I wanted to do is kind of take a little bit of a step back using some of the methodological interventions from my book to ask bigger picture questions about how we see Soviet nation building and nation building more generally across the Caucasus, rooted in the experience of the 20th century and the Soviet project, which is very much the focus of my book. So I will go over at a very high level some of the key questions and interventions of my book, and then try to provide a little bit of, comparison across Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, again, looking at the Soviet experience. My book is very much focused on Georgia, but of course, it's hard to talk about Georgia without talking about the broader region, not to mention Russia. And then from there, we'll introduce, some of the newer concepts, I guess, that I'm trying to use the Georgian case study to open up into a broader discussion about, what the meaning and result of Soviet nation building policies actually had, writ large across the Union, but also open up to discussion about what that means, over the past 30 years, right? And not just kind of in the context of nationalizing states, independence, et cetera, but as we get into discussions about Soviet nostalgia, democratic backsliding, Russian influence, et cetera. I mean, the resumed conflict, these are all things that I think have probably run through other panels over the course of the past day, as well as tomorrow. And so I think reconsidering the history of Soviet nation building in the Caucasus and its legacies, it's a useful time to do that, even though I think a lot of the questions are going to continue to evolve and be rather fluid, in the coming years. So as to my book, the title, I think, is important, and in particular the and. I'm looking at Georgian and Soviet, and in particular, the ways in which the Soviet nation-building apparatus, and there very much was one, was instrumental in allowing for the construction of a particular form of Soviet Georgian nationhood. So it's not in opposition. It's not, how to be Georgian in spite of being Soviet. It's how Georgians in particular in the Georgian SSR really mobilized and leveraged those Soviet institutions of nation building for their own purposes. This is a story that, of course, runs across the 70 years of the Soviet Georgian experience, but was not in any way uniform across that 7 decades. And so the "and" there is doing a bit of analytic work. It's, in my opinion, and I think I'm not alone in this, very difficult to talk about Soviet Georgia and the Soviet Georgian experience without talking about Stalin. And so while I'm not attempting in this book to try to write yet another biography of Stalin, there's thousands of pages out there already on that. But rather, I'm looking at the ways in which Stalin and his network, as well as their rise and fall over the course of several decades, what that longer term impact had on residents of Georgia proper. And this is very much a moving target, but one in my book that is really captured by the turning point of the events of March 1956, when tens of thousands of Georgians came to the streets demonstrating against the secret speech and the revelations that Khrushchev made there, in particular, his description of Stalin as a Georgian in a rather derogatory fashion. And of course, the violent suppression of that by Soviet troops. So that's sort of the Stalin story, but something that I do pick up a bit in the epilogue, I guess, with more questions than answers, maybe about what continued, Stalin reverence in a national guise has kind of in a contemporary Georgian political setting. And that's, of course, something that's not, limited to Georgia, but has particular Georgian, significance and variance, of course. Third, something that I really sought to do with this book and this project, I got started more than 10 years ago at this point, when I was searching for dissertation topics as a graduate student in Philadelphia. But what I really wanted to do was try to shift the vantage point of telling kind of the story of Soviet empire and Soviet nationality policies, so to speak, away from Moscow-centric perspectives. I felt that was telling, only a fraction of the story. It was missing, in my opinion, the most interesting parts of the story. And so what I wanted to do was really inverse how a lot of that work had been done by scholars, previously, and really lead with voices coming from Georgia, doing the overwhelming amount of my archival research from Georgia, as opposed to kind of looking at a lens through Moscow and thinking that was what mattered. And of course, plenty of other people are doing this now, but I think the war in Ukraine has kind of made it, that much more urgent and important. And you all, of course, this is not news to you, but unfortunately, I feel like in our field, we're kind of finally not having to justify as much why we're studying, the Caucasus as opposed to Moscow or parts of Russia. But I think to show the work in that regard will be ever more important going forward. Fourth, I really wanted to look at the Soviet Union as an empire. And by that, I mean a large landed polity that maintained hierarchies of difference as it incorporated new populations and territories. I found Jane Burbank and Frederick Cooper's book on empire very helpful from a theoretical perspective to kind of conceive of why and how and when the Soviet Union, was indeed acting imperially from an internal perspective. And this was sort of my underlying, definition for how I was looking at the sort of imperial mechanisms, imperial designs that the Soviet Union could have vis-a-vis its nationality policy, but also where and how and when and why Soviet efforts to truly be anti-imperial, which was the whole point of the project, failed. Fifth, my book really focuses on the post-war period, 1945, and it ends pretty abruptly in 1989, which I think for anyone in Georgia will understand why that date, and in particular, April 9th, 1989, would be the logical ending point for a book on Soviet and Georgia. The post-war period, I think, when I started this project 10 years ago, had been really under-researched, I think, particularly from the perspective of nationality policies. There was a tendency to look very deeply at the 20s and 30s and kind of the era of Korenizatsiya, when those policies were first being developed and elaborated. And then, the terror happens, and then you kind of jump to 1985. with the underlying assumption that not a whole lot changed in the interim, even if maybe there wasn't a top-down explicitly elaborated nationality policy in that interim. Needless to say, that was not the case. There were lots of, fascinating, dynamic, and inconsistent things happening, kind of away from Moscow's reach in some cases in that interim period, and it largely also coincides in the case of Georgia with this very interesting moment that I think is encapsulated in some ways between Stalin and Shevardnadze, but put another way, the era from 1953 to 1985, when Georgia did not have a so-called patron in Moscow in senior level positions. And it's precisely in this period when you see the real sort of rootedness and flourishing of the Georgian kind of form of Soviet nation could take root. And it's in many ways because of this sort of strange social contract or compromise that has to be made after these violent events of 1956. But that's really the sort of the main temporal focus of the book. And then finally, I kind of referenced this already, but sources were a big somewhat of a difference for my book, overwhelmingly coming from Tbilisi-based archives, lots of different archives, mix of Georgian and Russian, depending on what the institution was. Of course, also looked at a number of memoirs and other, secondary literature in kind of local languages as well, but really privileging that Tbilisi angle or Georgian location over things that might be coming from the quote unquote center. Next slide, please. So just and to give us a quick sort of situational awareness here. We're all familiar with the Soviet landscape of the Caucasus. I think that's why we're in this room. But in some ways, I think the conclusions that I have been able to draw in my book would be broadly applicable across the South Caucasus for a few different reasons. In other cases, Georgia remains somewhat exceptional, or perhaps we see similarities maybe in the experience of Georgia and Armenia, but Azerbaijan looks a bit different. So to just maybe tick through a few of these, all three republics of the South Caucasus had extensive autonomies within them, though Georgia had the most. But needless to say, these are Soviet borders that were hotly contested in the Soviet period, that continue to be hotly contested, and I think that's an understatement. In terms of ethnodemographic composition of the republics themselves, I think in the case of all three republics, we saw over the course of the Soviet period, and this was by design, republics looking more homogenous in favor of the dominant nationality over time. But Armenia was always, I guess, the most homogenous in terms of Armenian population, Azerbaijan maybe second, and then Georgia third. But we see over the course of the Soviet period a variety of tools used kind of from this imperial toolkit to encourage that sort of increasing homogeneity. And I'll talk a bit more about that on the next page. In the case of Armenia as well as Georgia, there was ethnic Georgian leadership, and by that I define it as first secretary of the Communist Party locally for the entire Soviet experiment. This is unusual for the Soviet Union writ large, and Azerbaijan had that relatively early in the game as well. So that does make the Caucasus look a little bit different compared to, say, Central Asia, for example. In the case of Georgia, throughout the 70 years, there were disproportionately high Georgian party membership, education levels, and that sort of thing, as well as relatively low penetration of Russian as a professed second language among ethnic Georgians. And that also looks quite different, I think, to Azerbaijan and Armenia. Next slide, please. So as I noted at the top, the Soviet Union did definitely have a nation-building cause and toolkit. It was unique to the Soviet Union, but also took a lot of borrowings from, I think other imperial toolboxes, so to speak. So we see over the course of the Soviet experiment, over time, and particularly kind of looking at the sort of mid to late 30s as a point of change, a move from what Eurasian has called ethnophilia in the 20s and early 30s, where, the Soviet Union invested an incredible amount of resources in developing, even very, very small nationalities, or what, some might consider to be, subnational groups and that sort of thing, such that you have hundreds of groups represented on the first Soviet census in 1956. So that's sort of one extreme, and then shifting by, the subsequent census in 1937 or 39, depending on which one, you consider to be the official one, since the 37 one was actually canceled, to a smaller number of, developed or developing nationalities that, from a top-down perspective, those were the ones that would be really endowed with this sort of full trappings of possibility for national development and rootedness, and the smaller groups would then be assimilated or amalgamated into those bigger categories. And this is something we definitely saw in the case of Georgia, as well as in Azerbaijan, in particular. So this kind of toolkit of Soviet nation building included things like, defining and then assimilating or amalgamating census nationality categories. In the case of Georgia, we saw this from, listing Svan, Laz, and Mingrelian as individual census categories in 1926, to then all, being subsumed as a single Georgian category by 1939. We see something similar in the case of Azerbaijan, where groups that might have been listed as otherwise in the early 20s, all of a sudden are just Azerbaijani. Similarly, on the language front, since language and nationality were very closely intertwined in Soviet thinking, language groups and distinctions similarly were amalgamated into ones that matched the republic level nationality. The ability to demarcate and in some cases dispute borders and territory. This, of course, is something that has, I think, particular significance in the Caucasus, and something that, in the post-Soviet period, clearly has a lot of importance, but, something that I talk quite a bit about in the book, using Abkhazia as a key kind of case study, is the extent to which, territorial disputes, claims, and that sort of thing, have deep Soviet roots, and not necessarily from the 20s. There are very important dynamics happening in terms of local mobilization, dynamics between autonomous republic capitals, and Moscow, an effort to sort of make new claims to territory and borders, and adjust those claims over time as political conditions change. Additionally, we see processes of, writing national histories, building national canons, and that sort of thing. This is happening across the Union, but what we get then by kind of in the 30s and 40s are cults of Rustaveli, histories of the Georgian, people, that sort of thing, and those are, in one way, I guess, top-down projects, because every developed nationality needed its history and its canon constructed, but they also allowed for, I guess, a lot of room for maneuver at the local level, as historians, archaeologists, literary scholars, et cetera, shaped that kind of in a more micro level. We have the familiar Soviet metric of nomenclatura and cadre. Always wanting the republic to, look, I guess, as it is named, such that Georgians in Georgia, Armenians in Armenia, et cetera, do have those sort of appropriately enumerated positions as far as party membership and that sort of thing. And that's a story that goes across the Soviet period, of course, but also across the Soviet Union. Something that also has, I think, an important and often somewhat overlooked, I think, in the broader scope of Soviet and Eastern European history, is the role that deportations, expulsions, and internal forced resettlements has had in terms of the Soviet imperial toolkit. This is something that I look at in my book, in particular in the sort of post-war period, in particular from 1944 to 1951, where there were quite a number of deportation operations from Georgia and the Caucasus more broadly. There have also are a number of operations from, from Azerbaijan and Armenia, as well as between Azerbaijan and Armenia, of course, in this period too. So, needless to say, that plays an important role in the demographic makeup of the republics, but of course is also twinned with the impact of the terror, a decade or so prior, really shows the dark and violent extremes of what the Soviet nation building toolkit, included, and also what that looked like kind of on a local level in terms of execution and, implementation. And so, this is a toolkit. It's pretty diverse. Most of these, I think, could be seen in other examples of empire over time or nationalizing states, something that plenty of other scholars have written about in sociology, political science, and elsewhere. But what I, really sought to do in my book, and I think a similar case could be made for Armenia and Azerbaijan as well, is looking at how the dominant nationalities in Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan really used these tools, and in some cases tried to push beyond them, push the bounds of what Moscow may have wanted, to pursue and claim their national rights as they understood them in the Soviet period. And so, can you go to the next slide? That really leads me to my main, I guess, methodological intervention with this book. And it's introducing a concept called entitled nationhood. And this really came from a dissatisfaction I've had for quite some time with using the term titular nationality to describe Georgians and Georgia, Armenians and Armenia, et cetera, in the Soviet period. I found that to be analytically not really telling us a whole lot. But I think more importantly, very limiting and isolating in terms of our discipline. Scholars of Soviet nationality policy or criminologists, I guess, in the sort of pre-1991 period would use those terms. Their peers would know what they meant kind of in the immediate scholarly space, but it didn't really allow for engagement across disciplinary lines or in other kind of geographic or temporal contexts. So, I felt it was limiting in that respect. And then it also seemed to me to be rather passive. It didn't endow the people that it was talking about with a whole lot of agency. And that, frankly, was not the type of, protagonist that I was encountering in the archives. And this was true really across the Stalin divide, certainly, but throughout the period that I was looking at in my book. And so for the topic there, the terminology I'm trying to introduce here is that of entitled nationhood. And so this reflects the status of ethnic Georgians in the Georgian SSR, Armenians in the ASSR, et cetera. And what I'm seeking to do with this is to have it embrace the statistical and legal implications of living in one's own territory, which by design, through these Soviet nation building sort of apparatuses, endows them with special rights and privileges. And this wasn't just on theory, it didn't just exist on paper. This was something that individuals and groups over the course of the Soviet period did demand these national rights in practice. They weren't always successful, but they did consistently appeal to these rights as something that they could and should claim as entitled nationals. There is a change over time across the Stalin divide. We see, I think in the Stalin era, in Georgia at least, this being more of an elite phenomenon. You see senior Georgian officials or party leadership or senior scholars, that sort of thing, trying to appeal to the Moscow center, kind of appealing to their Georgianness in some instances, or trying to push the bounds of what it meant to have these sort of special national rights at a local level. But really, after Stalin's death and these events in March 1956 in Georgia, we see it become much more of a civic or almost grassroots phenomenon, where you have people all across the republic, elite, non-elite, peasants, workers, et cetera, men, women, as well as non-Georgians, trying to claim and appeal to official decision makers on the basis of these national rights. And I think the main sort of source base that I've used to kind of glean at this was looking at letters and petitions, over the course of these several decades. And you do really see that change over time there, but a consistent appeal to these rights, as they understood them. So this means that the republic level, so in the case of Georgia, there really was a hierarchy of rights that could be claimed and tested over time. Which meant that kind of once we get to the 50s, 60s, et cetera, a real hegemony of entitled nationhood comes into force. And again, this is precisely in the period when Georgians didn't necessarily have a patron in Moscow, yet they were increasingly able to have control over matters on a local level. As part of this hierarchy, that means that only one group is at the top. And so it necessarily has impacts on non-entitled groups in the Republic, be they, minorities with large, with their own republics, next door, for example, in the case of Armenians or Azerbaijanis, it could be Russians, it could be Ukrainians, Greeks, et cetera. They had fewer rights in practice than Georgians in Georgia. At the same time, we have, of course, the important exceptions or almost counterexamples, I guess, of autonomous regions, and in particular Abkhazia, where the Abkhaz on paper were an entitled nationality, but in practice were not able to sort of exercise those rights and claims in the same way, perhaps, that was on paper, though, of course, they did try over the course of the Soviet period. And it also, I think, the structure allows entitled nationalities to adopt positions of situational minorityhood at various points. For example, having a very small minority when looked at the sort of union-wide population, viewing Soviet policies as Russian intrusions and that sort of thing, but on the local level, still having dominance over the situation. We also see the situational minorityhood concept playing out in interesting ways, kind of outside of the capital, in this case, Tbilisi, looking at border regions in particular along the Armenian and Azerbaijani borders, where the populations were overwhelmingly kind of those groups as opposed to Georgians. And so local Georgians kind of adopting positions of fear, victimhood, et cetera, and making the case that their rights were being violated because they did not have sort of full command over local power and authority in spite of their rights as entitled nationals. So this is a framework, I'd be very interested in, the extent to which you think it applies or not to, various elements of Armenian and Azerbaijani Soviet history. But I think, this is a starting point, and it is very much driven by my archival findings from Georgia. Can we go to the next slide? And I think, it's in the post-Soviet period, and in particular now as just, as a region, as disciplines, et cetera, there's a lot of rethinking about how we're looking at the Soviet period, as well as the role that Russia has had in the region, and everything that flows from it. And so since this is CRRC, I thought it would be good to maybe take a look at the Caucasus Barometer surveys to get at some of these questions of Soviet legacy and Soviet nostalgia. And this is just surface level, but I know, at least in the case of Georgia, the question of Soviet nostalgia, Soviet legacy, as well as, the lingering specter of Stalin are all very, lively debates still in Georgian political discourse. And so looking, and unfortunately, we don't have the Azerbaijan included in the barometer for these years, but I still think looking at Georgia and Armenia is pretty interesting and instructive. So for 2021, viewing in Georgia that 38% of those surveyed thought that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a bad thing. 38% is not insignificant, but it's not the majority. But I still think that that bears a lot of inquiry into what and how that number, what it represents. But comparing that to Armenia, where 67% of the population, 2 years ago viewed the dissolution of the Soviet Union as a bad thing for Armenia. I mean, that's remarkably high. And I think it's perhaps most interesting and perhaps instructive if you go to the next slide, comparing where it was 2 years prior in 2019. So you see, a 20-point difference or increase in the case of Armenia for looking at the dissolution of the Soviet Union as a bad thing. I would defer to the Armenia experts in the room for why this might be. The resumption of the war in 2020, I can't help but think that might have something to do with it, but among other things. But at a very, very high level, what I think these numbers tell us is that Soviet history is far from over in the South Caucasus. It continues to be a point of contention and debate in the public sphere. And it's something that, from an educational perspective, from a research perspective, as well as like a public history perspective, it deserves much more, grounded research discussion and rigorous debate in order to really fully understand what the Soviet Union was, what Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan kind of meant in the broader kind of constellation of the Soviet Union, and what that means in a post-Soviet setting. So these are all questions that we probably won't answer today, but I'm hopeful that at least this, my book and this kind of entitled Nationhood Framework can start to get at some of those, further some of those discussions. So with that, since I do want to have time for discussion, I will stop and hope that we can continue with Q&A and liven things up a little bit.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaiser, and I guess we can open up the floor for Q&A. Professor Sahadeo, please.
I don't necessarily mean to be the first one, but thanks, Claire. It's nice to see you. Nicer to see you when you were actually in Tbilisi, but it's good to see you here. And thanks I finally get to see your talk as I was on the airplane coming here when you gave it here. But I really do appreciate your entitled nationalities framework for the very reasons that you said. I think it is very explanatory. I have two questions that are very different. The first one is I want to just maybe push you a little bit on the hegemony of entitled nations, because I do think maybe that might be leaving less room for nuance than I would like in terms of the negotiation of all of this. And now I'm doing a completely different project, but doing some oral histories with people in Svaneti who actually, and maybe this goes back to Soviet nostalgia, but who say, well, in the Soviet period, there were certain protections for Svan culture. There was a recognition that there was a Svan nation in a sense, right, with some limits around it. Certainly, as you mentioned, they were considered to be Georgians, but their belief was under the Soviet Union and under that system, there was a greater ability to protect Svan nationhood than there is now. And I think there were two things. I mean, there was obviously a contemporary Georgian nation that's also nationalizing, but also just a broader capitalist system that really can run over some of these categories that maybe were better in the Soviet system. So maybe to have you comment a little bit on to what degree you think hegemony is the best term for this. And the second question, again, completely unrelated, is I was just curious again from my own work, which is looking more at sort of role of nature in Georgian culture, and how, when you see Georgian cultural development in the post-war period, how much of it's very syncretic from top down and bottom up, or how much of it is generated from one or the other side when they're developing? Obviously, I'm more familiar with the Central Asian case, but there were a series of textbooks coming out of the 1950s teaching someone how to be Uzbek or how to be Georgian. This is what our history is. This is what our cultural elements are. But in the Georgian case, did a lot of that filter downwards, or was there material filtering upwards from Georgians themselves who are trying to envision, say, a post-1956 Georgia, for example, and how you see that dynamic working? Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff, and glad to see you're in the room there. So on the hegemony point, the Svaneti anecdote that you mentioned is actually very fascinating, and I'd love to hear more about that at some point. I think the way that I'm trying to use this concept of the hegemony of entitled nationality is more, well, in some cases it's aspirational, I guess. The sort of leadership at the republic level is using the Soviet nation-building toolkit to give themselves, the sort of maximum power of affairs in the republic, allowing, diminishing, I guess, minority voices or alternate voices, or in some cases, Russian influence. And so I think in some ways it's aspirational. It's something that the Georgians had a little bit more work to do, I guess, at least in terms of the percentage of the population that was actually Georgian, according to the census. Over the course of the Soviet period, we're looking at, between 60 and 70% of the population was ethnic Georgian, according to the all union censuses. But that's a lot lower than even Armenia and Azerbaijan. And so I think that idea of hegemony is something that, is a goal, is not necessarily something that might always trickle down, especially to some of these, extremely remote mountainous regions. That was always a challenge, and something that, I was seeing into the 70s and 80s, archivally, really struggling to incorporate some of those regions in Svaneti or Tusheti, into the sort of modern Soviet Georgian fold. And I think that continues to be a problem. But that's kind of how I'm trying to use the concept, I guess. On the cultural production front, this is something that I guess the answer might be both. We see in the 30s and 40s, a few very prominent and active Georgian scholars, in particular coming from archaeology and history, writing the history of Georgia, from the earliest days to Russian encounter kind of textbooks, something that Stalin, took great interest in and provided some, editorial guidance at times as well in the 40s. And so, those textbooks and those historians and archaeologists continue to, be kind of the greats of, regarded as the greats of Georgia, or of Georgian history. Things are still named after them in Tbilisi, for what that's worth, which I think counts for a lot. They're still buried in the Pantheon, et cetera. When we get to the kind of post-1956 period, we see, things are more localized and I think less focused on modern history and revisiting some of those, older historical questions, with a couple of big exceptions. You see the ethnogenesis turn kind of in the 60s in particular, and this was true across the South Caucasus of ethnographers and archaeologists trying to lay claim to, being this church was actually Caucasian Albanian, or this church was actually Armenian, or this church was actually Georgian, et cetera, and kind of, using archaeology and Soviet institutions like academies of sciences and that sort of thing at the local level to sort of wage those debates. And that was extremely lively, I think, on the local level, really from the 60s through the 80s, and not something that I think was always necessarily mediated or filtered through the center, but at a local level was quite vibrant. I think on the a couple of exceptions that I do look at in my book, we have moments in 1957 and 1967 where historiography becomes a ground for popular mobilization regarding Abkhazia. There's a book that actually was published 10 years prior, but in 1957 kind of gets resurfaced by a scholar called Pavle Ingorokva. And it's, about a monk that lived, 1,000 years ago and his sort of life and world. But it gets into the question of, who settled Abkhazia first, are they really Georgian, et cetera. And needless to say, that became an issue of profound interest for certain groups in Abkhazia. So there are pretty widespread demonstrations there against this work and the Georgian party's promotion of it in 1957. And these debates kind of resurface again from another Georgian historian 10 years later in 1967. So you see, historiographical and what typically would be regarded as pretty weedy academic debates kind of gaining public currency and really being at the center of mobilization efforts, between Georgia and Abkhazia.
Thanks so much. Yes.
Thank you. Perry Carter, Princeton University. I really enjoyed your talk, and I appreciate your criticisms of the titular nationality framework. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit in greater depth about how you view your concept of entitled nationalities as relating to that. And in particular, whether you kind of justified it as some of the unfortunate connotations that term might carry, or the difficulties it has in traveling across borders in space and time. So would you view your framework as something that, for example, we might be able to find examples of titular nationalities in various periods in Soviet history or in different republics that were not entitled? So do they overlap in that sense? And then conversely, is this something that you might view as perhaps traveling outside of the Soviet context, that there might be something that looks like an entitled nationality that can't be found within this sort of narrower context that we would normally use the term of titular? Thank you.
And thanks for the question, and good to meet you. So I think what among the many things I'm trying to do with this concept is, I think for a variety of reasons, there's been a tendency to take for granted the sort of institutional structures of the Soviet sort of project, right? Soviet constitutions, the sort of ideological underpinnings of what the Soviet Union was about. And we can disregard, a lot of that, right? Just say, oh, that was on paper, but no one really believed it. Okay, that's fine. But if that's not kind of that's not what I was seeing, in the protagonists or individuals that I was kind of encountering in letters and that sort of things in the archives. And so, this is really about, I think, trying to situate this concept in a broader sort of conversation about rights and claims and privileges and hierarchies, right? And so that could have, I hope, broader applicability to other imperial settings, but also any sort of setting where these national hierarchies are sort of constructed on paper and viewed as rights-based. I know that this the sort of paper versus practice has other tensions, in Soviet history, of course, but over time, really seeing people coming together to demand these rights and these privileges and the maintenance of this hierarchy, whether it was in the high Stalin era, whether it was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it's the sort of rhetoric might change over time. The basis of the claims that people are appearing to might change over time, but there is that sort of narrative thread. And so, it's something that I very much hope, people working in Kazakhstan or Ukraine or Belarus or, you name it, can kind of look at and say, oh, is Georgia exceptional here? Or are there elements of this where, there is some truth to at least how this sort of structure of rights is being understood, and the extent to which they were able at the local level to push the bounds of that kind of, agency and latitude. I'm hopeful, kind of getting to your second question, that this does allow for a bit more of, comparative engagement outside of the Soviet case. I would certainly want to look at a polity like, maybe, the sort of Austro-Hungarian Empire, potentially seeing the extent to which it's useful for looking backward at the Russian Empire, which of course had its own hierarchical structure of, titles and entitlements and that sort of thing, though of course toward a very different ideological end, and see the extent to which this is helpful looking, temporally over time as well as geographically elsewhere. Something that, after finishing this book, have increasingly wanted to read more about how China has structured its, nationality policies and hierarchies. I am by no means an expert on China and don't want to pretend to be, but I think that is, given where we are in the world today, kind of the key comparison that we as scholars of the Eurasian space probably need to be looking at comparatively, the extent to which they have been able to successfully or unsuccessfully kind of use elements of the Soviet nation building toolkit for the Chinese context. And so a project for somebody else, but I think one worth doing.
I guess we can take one more question and then Tim.
Hi, Claire. And just to be a little bit mischievous, you might be aware of the recent article that Jeremy Smith published, something like, "What is Soviet nationality policy?" Where basically he says there were no major proclamations about Soviet nationality policy after the early 1920s, that there's no policy really there, that it doesn't explain, it's not useful as an explanatory framework. I have my own thoughts about that, but I'm curious about what you think about that and what your answer might be to his article.
Have been a clearly articulated policy from Moscow, but that doesn't mean that at a local level, they weren't trying to find ways to interpret that in their own ways. And so I think that for me, that's one of the most interesting aspects of the fact that it wasn't top down, after the mid 1930s when the Commissariat of Nationalities was dissolved. It's what does that mean for the kind of executors, the elites of the entitled nationalities at the republic level? Like, what do they do with that sort of framework and that increased, latitude and room for creativity, I suppose, after the sort of Moscow clear policy directive goes away. And I don't think that you're going to get a consistent story across the republics. I think Georgians are clearly able to mobilize and interpret and innovate on that project in a different way than Armenians and Azerbaijanis, presumably. You are likely going to see something different, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, et cetera. And so, and that's kind of, for me, the interesting thing about the Soviet imperial project is what happens when that sort of top-down element, somewhat goes away, but not necessarily in a consistent fashion. What room for creativity and latitude, which has, I think, creative and destructive consequences at the local level. What does that look like in a comparative context across the Soviet history in terms of time, but also in terms of space?
Thank you so much. I think, we can wrap up the first day of our conference, and let me please join me in thanking Dr. Kaiser in delivering such a fascinating keynote speech. Thank you so much for joining us early in the morning, your time, and just a quick sneak peek about